Before we can trace the evolution of socialist thought, we need to understand what socialism actually is, beyond the slogans and political rhetoric. Socialism is not a single unified doctrine. It is a constellation of ideas, movements and experiments that share a common concern: the relationship between economic power and human freedom. At its core, socialism begins with an observation and a question. The observation is that in market economies, wealth and productive resources concentrate in relatively few hands. The question is, does this concentration of economic power undermine genuine freedom and equality, even in societies that claim to be democratic? The socialist answer, broadly speaking, is yes. But socialists have disagreed profoundly about why this matters, what should be done about it, and what a better system would look like. Some socialists have sought revolution, others gradual reform. Some have emphasized state control, others worker ownership or decentralized cooperation. Some have grounded their ideas in economic analysis, others in moral philosophy or religious conviction. What unites these diverse traditions is a belief that economic arrangements are not natural or inevitable, but human creations that can and should be remade to serve human needs more justly. This video will explore how these ideas emerged, developed, competed with one another, succeeded, failed, and continue to shape our world today. Part 1. The birth of socialist ideas. From early critics to the Industrial Revolution. To understand where socialist ideas come from, we must first understand what they were reacting against. Socialism did not emerge in a vacuum. It arose as a response to profound economic and social transformations that began in Western Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution was not simply the invention of new machines. It represented a fundamental reorganization of human work and social life. For centuries, most people had lived in agricultural societies where production was organized around households, guilds, and small workshops. Workers often owned their tools and had some control over their labor. This was not paradise, of course. Life was hard, hierarchical, and often brutally unfair. But the relationship between work and survival had a certain directness to it. The rise of industrial capitalism changed this fundamentally. Production moved from homes and small workshops into large factories. Workers no longer owned the tools they used or the products they made. Instead, they sold their labor for wages to those who owned the factories, the machines, and the raw materials. Economists call these productive assets capital, and those who own them capitalists. This new system proved extraordinarily productive. It generated wealth at a scale previously unimaginable. But it also created new forms of poverty, insecurity, and powerlessness. Workers crowded into industrial cities where they worked 14 or 16-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered survival. Children as young as 5 or 6 years old labored in mines and textile mills. There were no safety regulations, no minimum wages, no limits on working hours, no unemployment insurance. The early critics, who would come to be called socialists, looked at these conditions and asked, "Is this progress? Is this freedom?" Yes, the new system produced more goods. But who benefited from this productivity and at what human cost? One of the first thinkers to articulate what we now recognize as socialist ideas was François-Noël Babeuf, who lived through the French Revolution of 1789. Babeuf watched as the revolution overthrew the monarchy and proclaimed liberty, equality and fraternity. But he observed that political revolution alone did not end in equality. The wealthy remained wealthy, the poor remained poor. Private property in land and productive resources meant that real freedom and equality remained out of reach for most people. Babeuf argued that genuine equality required the common ownership of land and productive resources, with goods distributed according to need rather than according to wealth or market power. He organized a conspiracy to bring about this vision, which was discovered. Babeuf was executed in 1797, but his ideas survived him. Around the same time, other critics were developing similar insights. In Britain, Thomas Spence argued for common ownership of land. William Godwin criticized how property concentrates power and corrupts human relationships. These early socialist thinkers shared a conviction that private ownership of productive resources was incompatible with genuine human freedom and equality. But these early socialists had a problem. They could describe what was wrong with the emerging capitalist system, but they struggled to explain how a better system could actually work. How would production be organized without private ownership? How would goods be distributed without markets? How would people be motivated to work? The next generation of socialist thinkers tried to answer these questions more systematically. Historians call them the utopian socialists, though this label is somewhat misleading and was originally used dismissively. These thinkers included figures like Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. Saint-Simon, writing in France in the early 1800s, envisioned a society organized rationally according to scientific principles. He believed that society should be run by engineers, scientists and industrialists, the people who actually produced useful things, rather than by idle aristocrats living off inherited wealth. Production should be planned to meet human needs, rather than left to the chaos of market competition. Charles Fourier had more radical and, frankly, stranger ideas. He imagined restructuring society into small cooperative communities he called phalanxes, each containing around 1,600 people. These communities would organize production cooperatively, with work made enjoyable rather than alienating. Fourier believed that in the right social arrangements, even necessary but unpleasant work could be made attractive. His ideas about making work fulfilling rather than merely endurable would influence socialist thought for generations, even when his more eccentric proposals were forgotten. Robert Owen, a wealthy factory owner in Scotland, actually tried to put socialist ideas into practice. At his cotton mill in New Lanark, Owen reduced working hours, improved conditions, refused to employ children under 10, and provided education and decent housing. His factory remained profitable, which Owen saw as proof that enlightened management could benefit both workers and owners. But Owen became convinced that more radical change was needed. He invested his fortune in creating experimental socialist communities, including one in New Harmony, Indiana. These communities were meant to prove that cooperative communal living could work in practice. Most of them failed within a few years, undermined by internal disputes, economic difficulties, and the practical challenges of building alternative social systems within a capitalist world. The failures of these experiments led later socialists to criticize the utopian approach. You cannot simply create islands of cooperation in a sea of capitalism and expect them to survive or spread. More fundamental change would be necessary. But these early utopian socialists made lasting contributions. They demonstrated that the existing economic system was not the only possible one. They tried to think systematically about how cooperative, egalitarian societies might actually function. They raised questions that would preoccupy socialist thought for the next 2 centuries. How should work be organized? How should goods be distributed? What motivates people to contribute to collective well-being? Can human nature adapt to cooperative rather than competitive social arrangements? By the 1830s and 1840s, these ideas were spreading beyond isolated intellectuals and experimental communities. Working people themselves began organizing and articulating their own critiques of industrial capitalism. The Chartist movement in Britain, for instance, fought for political reforms that would give working-class men the vote. Early trade unions formed, though they were often illegal and faced violent repression. It was in this context, with industrial capitalism transforming Europe, working-class movements emerging, and socialist ideas circulating but still inchoate and fragmented, that Karl Marx appeared on the scene. Marx would transform socialist thought from a collection of moral critiques and utopian proposals into something he claimed was scientific, a comprehensive theory of how capitalism worked, why it would inevitably fail, and how a socialist society would emerge to replace it. Part 2. Marx and Marxism, the scientific turn in socialist thought. Karl Marx did not invent socialism, but he transformed it so profoundly that even socialists who rejected his conclusions had to engage with his ideas. Marx claimed to have discovered the laws of motion governing capitalist societies, laws as rigorous and scientific as those governing physical nature. Whether or not this claim was justified, his analysis provided socialist movements with a systematic framework that earlier critics had lacked. Marx was born in 1818 in Prussia, studied philosophy and spent most of his adult life in London, working as a journalist and scholar while living in poverty. His collaborator Friedrich Engels, the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer, provided financial support and co-authored many works. Together they developed what became known as Marxism or scientific socialism. Marx's central insight was that to understand any society, you must first understand how it produces the material necessities of life. He called this the material base or economic foundation of society. Everything else, the political systems, legal structures, religious beliefs, cultural values, what Marx called the superstructure, ultimately derives from and reflects this economic base. This might sound like crude economic determinism, and some of Marx's followers did interpret it that way. But Marx's point was more sophisticated. He was arguing against the dominant philosophical traditions of his time, which treated ideas, beliefs, and political institutions as if they developed independently of material conditions. Marx insisted, before people can philosophize, create art, or build political systems, they must eat, clothe themselves, and find shelter. How a society organizes production shapes everything else about that society. In capitalist societies, Marx argued, production is organized around a fundamental relationship between those who own capital, the means of production, and those who own only their labor power. Capitalists purchase labor power from workers, combine it with raw materials and machinery, and produce commodities that they sell for profit. This seems straightforward enough, but Marx claimed to have discovered something hidden beneath these surface appearances. Where does profit come from? Marx's answer: from the exploitation of labor. Now, Marx used exploitation in a specific technical sense, not merely as a moral condemnation. His argument went like this: workers sell their labor power for wages that correspond to the cost of reproducing that labor power, meaning the cost of keeping workers alive and able to work. But workers produce more value in a day than the cost of their own maintenance. This difference, what Marx called surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. Here is a concrete example to make this tangible. Imagine a worker in a shoe factory. The capitalist pays this worker $10 for a day's labor. This wage covers the worker's food, shelter, and other necessities, enough to keep the worker coming back tomorrow. But in that day, the worker produces shoes that sell for $50 after accounting for the cost of leather, tools, and other materials. That extra $40 is surplus value, which the capitalist keeps as profit. Marx insisted this was not theft in the legal sense. The capitalist is not breaking any laws or contracts. The worker freely agreed to work for wages. Yet Marx argued this relationship was exploitative because the worker has no real choice. Without access to means of production, without capital, the worker must sell labor power to survive. The relationship appears voluntary but is actually coercive. This analysis led Marx to several crucial conclusions. First, class conflict is built into capitalism. Workers and capitalists have fundamentally opposing interests. Workers want higher wages, which means less profit for capitalists. Capitalists want to maximize profit, which means suppressing wages and intensifying work. This is not about individual greed or virtue. It is structural, built into the system itself. Second, capitalism is inherently crisis-prone. Marx identified several tendencies that would lead capitalism toward recurrent crises. Competition forces capitalists to invest in labor-saving machinery to reduce costs. But since profit comes from exploiting labor, this reduces the source of profit. Marx called this the falling rate of profit. Meanwhile, as capitalists compete, smaller firms fail and capital concentrates in fewer hands. Workers, facing competition from labor-saving machinery and from each other, see their wages driven down toward subsistence. But if workers cannot afford to buy the goods being produced, where will capitalists sell their products? This leads to crises of overproduction, economic depressions, massive unemployment. Third, and most importantly, capitalism creates the conditions for its own overthrow. The concentration of workers in large factories creates the possibility of collective action. Economic crises radicalize workers and demonstrate the irrationality of the system. The development of productive forces under capitalism makes a more rational, planned economy possible. Eventually, Marx predicted the working class would overthrow capitalism and establish socialism. What would socialist society look like? Marx was frustratingly vague about this, deliberately so. He criticized utopian socialists for drawing up detailed blueprints for future societies. Marx believed you could not design socialism from your armchair. It would emerge from the actual struggles of the working class. But Marx did offer some hints. In the immediate aftermath of revolution, there would be a transitional period he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. This did not necessarily mean dictatorship as we understand it today, rule by a single person or party. Marx used dictatorship in the classical sense, meaning the political rule or dominance of one class, just as capitalist society was the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Socialist society would be the dictatorship of the working class. During this transition, the state would take control of the means of production. Production would be organized according to a rational plan rather than left to market anarchy. Goods would be distributed according to work contributed, with everyone required to work who was able. Eventually, Marx believed this would give way to full communism, a classless society. Once the means of production were commonly owned, there would no longer be a capitalist class or a working class, just people cooperating to meet their needs. The state itself would wither away. Why would a state be necessary in a classless society? The state, Marx argued, was fundamentally an instrument of class domination. In a society without classes, without systematic conflicts of interest, political coercion would become unnecessary. In this communist society, production would be organized according to the principle, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. People would contribute what they could to the common good and take what they needed. Work itself would be transformed, becoming creative and fulfilling rather than alienating drudgery. This vision was inspiring to millions, but it also raised profound questions that Marx never adequately answered. How exactly would a planned economy work? Who would decide what to produce, how much, and for whom? Marx dismissed concerns about economic calculation without markets, assuming this was a technical problem that could be solved. But was it? What would prevent the dictatorship of the proletariat from becoming simply a new form of tyranny? Marx assumed that once the working class held power, there would be no need for the oppressive apparatus of the capitalist state. But what if concentrating all economic and political power in the state created new forms of domination? Would the state really wither away? Marx offered no mechanism by which those holding state power would voluntarily relinquish it. His theory assumed that with the end of class conflict, the state would become unnecessary and simply fade. But is power that simple? Could human nature adapt to communist society? Marx believed human nature was not fixed, but shaped by social conditions. Under capitalism, people appear selfish and competitive because the system rewards these traits. In a cooperative society, Marx believed people would become cooperative. But was this wishful thinking? These questions became urgent as Marxist movements came to power in the 20th century. But before we get there, we need to understand that Marxism was not the only revolutionary socialist tradition. At the same time Marx was developing his theories, another tradition was emerging that shared many of Marx's critiques, but reached very different conclusions about what should replace capitalism. Part 3. Anarchist Socialism, Freedom without the State. The split between Marxist and anarchist socialism was one of the most bitter and consequential divisions in the history of socialist thought. Both traditions emerged from similar roots, shared similar critiques of capitalism, and sought similar goals of equality and freedom. Yet they became fierce rivals, with consequences that shaped the trajectory of socialist movements worldwide. Anarchism, as a coherent political philosophy, developed alongside Marxism in the mid-19th century. The word anarchism comes from the Greek anarchos, meaning without rulers. But anarchism does not mean chaos or disorder, as popular usage often suggests. Anarchists believe in social order, but order based on voluntary cooperation rather than hierarchical authority. The founder of modern anarchist theory was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a French printer and self-taught intellectual. In 1840, Proudhon published What is Property?, where he gave his famous answer, "Property is theft." But Proudhon's argument was more nuanced than this slogan suggests. He distinguished between property and the means of production, which he opposed, and personal possessions, which he defended. Proudhon argued that when someone owns a factory or land that others must use to survive, that owner can extract wealth without working. The property owner, like the capitalist in Marx's analysis, appropriates the surplus created by others' labour. This was theft. But Proudhon's solution was different from Marx's. Instead of state ownership, Proudhon advocated what he called mutualism. Producers would own their own means of production, either individually or in small cooperatives. They would exchange goods and services directly with each other at cost, without profit. Credit would be provided by mutual banks owned by their members, charging only enough interest to cover administrative costs. This vision preserved individual freedom and autonomy while eliminating exploitation. No state would be necessary to plan production or distribute goods. People would coordinate through voluntary agreements and mutual aid. Proudhon's ideas influenced many working-class radicals, but it was Mikhail Bakunin who transformed anarchism into a revolutionary mass movement. Bakunin was a Russian aristocrat who rejected his privileged background to become a professional revolutionary, participating in uprisings across Europe. He was imprisoned, escaped from Siberian exile, and spent years organizing secret revolutionary societies. Bakunin agreed with Marx's critique of capitalism. He agreed that the working class must overthrow the existing order, but he fundamentally disagreed about what should come after. Marx argued that workers needed to seize state power and use it to transform society. Bakunin argued this was a fatal error. The state, any state, was inherently oppressive. Its very nature was to concentrate power in the hands of a few and impose their will on everyone else. A workers' state would simply create new rulers and new ruled, new oppressors and new oppressed. The revolutionary vanguard, Bakunin warned, would become a new ruling class. Bakunin's critique of Marx's program was prophetic. He wrote, "Take the most radical revolutionary and place him on the throne of all Russia, or give him dictatorial power, and before a year has passed he will have become worse than the Tsar himself." Instead of creating a revolutionary state, Bakunin argued, workers should immediately abolish all forms of authority: the state, the church, private property in the means of production. Society would be reorganized from the bottom up into free federations of workers' associations, agricultural communes, and local councils. These would coordinate through voluntary agreement without any central authority imposing decisions. The conflict between Marx and Bakunin split the First International Working Men's Association in the 1870s. Marx manoeuvred to expel Bakunin, But the anarchist movement continued to grow, especially in Southern Europe and Latin America. Another crucial anarchist thinker was Peter Kropotkin, a Russian prince who became an anarchist after witnessing the brutal conditions of peasants and workers. Kropotkin made important contributions to anarchist theory, particularly regarding human nature and cooperation. Social Darwinists of the late 19th century argued that human society, like nature, was defined by competitive struggle for survival. The wealthy and powerful succeeded because they were more fit. Hierarchy and competition were natural and inevitable. Kropotkin, who was himself a trained geographer and naturalist, argued this was a misreading of Darwin. In his book Mutual Aid, Kropotkin documented countless examples from the animal kingdom of cooperation, altruism, and mutual support. Species that cooperated, he argued, were often more successful than those that merely competed. The same was true of human societies. Throughout history, Kropotkin argued, human progress depended on mutual aid, people helping each other, sharing resources, cooperating to meet common needs. Competition and hierarchy were not natural, but imposed by states and ruling classes. In a free society, humans' natural inclination toward cooperation would flourish. Kropotkin envisioned a communist society, but without Marx's transitional state. Anarchist communism, as Kropotkin called it, would be based on free association. Communities would produce goods cooperatively and distribute them according to need. There would be no money, no wages, no buying and selling. People would take what they needed from common stores and contribute what they could to the common good. Was this naive utopianism? Kropotkin tried to ground his vision in concrete examples. He pointed to medieval free cities, guilds and communes that had practiced mutual aid. He documented contemporary examples, volunteer fire departments, mutual aid societies, cooperatives. He argued that even under capitalism, much of what made society function depended on voluntary cooperation, not market exchange or state coercion. In practice, anarchist movements developed in several directions. Anarcho-syndicalists, strong in France, Spain and Italy, focused on revolutionary trade unions as the vehicle for social transformation. Workers would organize themselves into industrial unions that would eventually take over production through a general strike, abolishing both capitalism and the state in one revolutionary act. The largest anarchist experiment occurred during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. In Catalonia and Aragon, anarchist workers and peasants collectivized factories and farms. They abolished money in some areas, organized production through workers' councils, and tried to create the free communist society Kropotkin had envisioned. These experiments were remarkable. George Orwell, fighting as a volunteer in Catalonia, described a society where class distinctions had been abolished, and waiters and shopwalkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Production continued, in some cases more efficiently than before. Decisions were made through assemblies where everyone had a voice. But the Spanish anarchist experiment faced overwhelming obstacles. It was attacked militarily by fascist forces under Franco. It was undermined by communist forces backed by the Soviet Union who opposed anarchist autonomy. And it faced internal difficulties coordinating production across regions without markets or central planning. By 1939, the experiment was crushed. But it had demonstrated that anarchist principles could be applied in practice, at least for a time, and under extreme conditions. The anarchist critique of Marxism proved prescient in important ways. Where Marxist-Leninist parties took power, they did create new forms of state domination. The dictatorship of the proletariat did become simple dictatorship. The state did not wither away, but grew more powerful. Yet anarchism faced its own difficulties. How could a complex industrial economy coordinate production without either markets or central planning? How could an anarchist society defend itself against states with organized militaries? How could the initial revolution succeed when states commanded such overwhelming force? Some anarchists embraced propaganda of the deed. Assassination and terrorism meant to inspire revolutionary action. Between 1870 and 1914, anarchists assassinated presidents, prime ministers and monarchs across Europe and America. But these acts did not spark revolution. They mainly succeeded in discrediting anarchism and provoking state repression. By the early 20th century, Marxist parties had become the dominant force in socialist movements worldwide, while anarchism was increasingly marginalized. But the anarchist critique did not disappear. It would resurface repeatedly whenever Marxist experiments demonstrated the dangers of concentrated state power. Part 4. Democratic Socialism and Social Democracy, the Reformist Path. While some socialists debated whether workers should seize power through revolution or first abolish the state, another group asked, why not achieve socialism gradually through democratic means? This reformist tradition, variously called democratic socialism or social democracy, became the most influential form of socialist politics in Western Europe and shaped the development of the modern welfare state. The tension between reform and revolution was built into Marxism from the beginning. Marx himself recognized that in democratic countries socialism might be achieved through the ballot box. Engels, late in his life, suggested that universal suffrage and parliamentary action might be more effective than violent revolution. But it was a German Marxist, Edward Bernstein, who systematically articulated the case for evolutionary socialism. In 1899, Bernstein published Evolutionary Socialism, which challenged core Marxist predictions. Bernstein argued that Marx's prophecies were not coming true. Workers' conditions were improving, not worsening. The middle class was growing, not disappearing. Capitalism was proving more adaptable and stable than Marx predicted. Recurrent crises had not led to capitalism's collapse. If capitalism was not inevitably doomed, Bernstein argued, socialists should stop waiting for the apocalyptic final crisis and instead work steadily to improve workers' lives through reforms. Shorter working hours, better wages, workplace safety laws, social insurance, progressive taxation, all these could be won through parliamentary action and trade union organizing. Gradually, the state could expand public ownership and regulation of the economy. Eventually, you would have socialism, achieved without revolution. Bernstein's revisionism, as it was called, sparked furious debate. Orthodox Marxists accused him of betraying revolutionary principles. Rosa Luxemburg, a brilliant Polish-German Marxist, wrote a devastating critique. She argued that reforms under capitalism were always precarious, always subject to reversal when capitalists regained strength. Only revolutionary transformation could guarantee workers' gains. Luxemburg also argued that the struggle itself was essential. It was through fighting for revolution, not through gradual reforms, that workers developed class consciousness and learned to govern themselves. Parliamentary socialism would leave workers passive, dependent on politicians to deliver improvements from above. But Bernstein's revisionism reflected the actual practice of socialist parties, particularly in Germany. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, despite its revolutionary rhetoric, was already focusing on elections and parliamentary work. It had won millions of votes and dozens of seats in parliament. It had become too successful to risk everything on revolutionary adventure. A similar evolutionary approach developed in Britain, though from different theoretical roots. The Fabian Society, founded in 1884, rejected Marxist revolution in favour of gradual systematic reform. The Fabians included intellectuals like George Bernard Shaw and Sidney and Beatrice Webb. The Fabians believed that socialism was inevitable, not because of class conflict and crisis, but because it was more rational and efficient than capitalism. As society became more complex, as production became more interconnected, as the problems of poverty, disease and ignorance became more pressing, the need for collective planning and public ownership would become obvious. Educated people would recognize this, and democracy would deliver socialism through patient persuasion and incremental reform. This was socialism as technocratic management, guided by experts and statisticians. The Fabians advocated nationalization of key industries, expansion of municipal services, and a strong welfare state. They believed in working through existing institutions, forming a political party, contesting elections, gradually transforming society through legislation. The Fabian strategy helped create the British Labour Party, which eventually implemented much of the Fabian programme after World War II. The government nationalised coal, steel, railways and utilities. It created the National Health Service, providing free healthcare to all citizens. It expanded public education and housing. It built a comprehensive welfare state that protected people from cradle to grave. Was this socialism? That depends on your definition. The means of production were not entirely publicly owned. Most of the economy remained in private hands. Markets and profit still operated, but the state now played a huge role in the economy, redistributing wealth through progressive taxation and providing universal public services. Similar developments occurred across Western Europe after 1945. Socialist and social democratic parties came to power in Scandinavia, Germany, France and elsewhere. They did not abolish capitalism, but they tamed it. They built what became known as the mixed economy, or the social democratic compromise. The model worked like this. Private enterprise would continue to generate wealth, but the state would regulate markets, provide public services, and redistribute income through taxation and welfare programs. Strong trade unions would bargain for higher wages and better conditions. Full employment would be maintained through government intervention. Everyone would have access to healthcare, education, housing, and income security. For several decades, this model appeared remarkably successful. Western European countries achieved rapid economic growth, rising living standards, and far greater equality than in the United States. They avoided both capitalist crisis and communist dictatorship. They seemed to have found a middle way. But was this really socialism, or merely reformed capitalism? Socialist parties themselves were divided on this question. Some argued that social democracy represented progress towards socialism. As public ownership expanded as the state took control of more economic functions, as workers gained more power through unions and parliamentary representation, eventually you would reach socialism. It was simply taking longer than Marx predicted. Others argued that social democracy had abandoned socialism. It left the capitalist class in control of investment decisions, of production, of the commanding heights of the economy. Welfare programs and regulations were concessions, won through working-class struggle, but they did not fundamentally challenge capitalist power. In times of crisis, when profits fell, even these concessions would be taken back. This debate intensified as the social democratic model ran into trouble in the 1970s and 1980s. Economic growth slowed, unemployment rose, inflation increased. Governments faced fiscal crises as tax revenues fell and welfare costs rose. Conservative politicians argued that social democracy had reached its limits. High taxes discouraged investment. Generous welfare benefits discouraged work. Powerful unions made labour markets inflexible. Government regulation stifled entrepreneurship. What was needed was less state intervention, not more. Many social democratic parties responded by moving rightward, accepting much of this critique. They embraced market-friendly reforms, privatizing state-owned industries, weakening labour protections, cutting welfare benefits, reducing taxes on the wealthy. They still called themselves socialist or social democratic, but their policies looked increasingly indistinguishable from those of moderate conservatives. Critics on the left argued that social democracy had failed its historical test. When capitalism entered crisis, social democratic parties abandoned their constituents and chose to preserve the capitalist system rather than challenge it. They had become managers of capitalism, not advocates for an alternative. Yet the social democratic achievement should not be dismissed. For several decades, Western European social democracies provided their citizens with living standards, security and equality that neither unregulated capitalism nor Soviet-style communism could match. They demonstrated that democratic governments could significantly reduce poverty and inequality while maintaining political freedom. The question remains, was social democracy a step toward socialism that stalled, a stable alternative to both capitalism and communism, or merely a temporary compromise that capitalism tolerated during unusual post-war conditions? This question continues to animate debates on the left today. Part 5. The Russian Revolution and Leninism. Socialism in Power. On October 25, 1917, according to the old Russian calendar, Bolshevik forces seized power in Russia. For the first time, a Marxist party had overthrown a government and claimed to be building socialism. This event would shape the course of socialism and of world history for the next century. Russia in 1917 seemed an unlikely place for socialist revolution. Marx had predicted that socialism would emerge in advanced industrial countries where capitalism had fully developed and created a large, organized working class. But Russia was still largely agricultural. About 80% of the population were peasants. The industrial working class was small, concentrated in a few cities. Moreover, Russia had only recently abolished serfdom in 1861. It was ruled by an autocratic monarchy, the Tsar, with no democratic institutions. According to orthodox Marxist theory, Russia first needed to go through a bourgeois revolution to establish capitalism and democracy. Only later, After capitalism had developed, could a socialist revolution occur? Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik faction of Russian Marxists, developed a theory that explained why socialist revolution was possible in backward Russia and how it could succeed. Lenin's first major innovation concerned the Revolutionary Party. In What Is to Be Done, published in 1902, Lenin argued that the working class, left to itself, would only develop trade union consciousness, meaning demands for better wages and conditions within capitalism. Revolutionary consciousness, the understanding that capitalism must be overthrown entirely, had to be brought to workers from outside by a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries. This party would be tightly organized, disciplined, and centralized. It would be composed of dedicated revolutionaries, not casual members. It would operate through democratic centralism, meaning decisions would be debated democratically, but once made, everyone would be bound to follow them. In practice, this often meant that the party leadership made decisions and lower ranks obeyed. Critics, including other Marxists, argued that Lenin was advocating an elitist conspiracy, not a workers' movement. Rosa Luxemburg warned that Lenin's organizational principles would lead to authoritarianism, with the party substituting itself for the working class. Lenin's second major innovation concerned imperialism. In 1916, Lenin argued that capitalism had entered a new stage: imperialism. Advanced capitalist countries had divided the world into colonial empires, exploiting resources and labor in the colonies to maintain profits and to buy off their own working classes with higher wages. This explained why revolution had not occurred in advanced countries as Marx predicted. Western workers had been incorporated into imperialism's benefits, but it also meant that the weakest link in the imperialist chain, a country like Russia, could break first. Revolution in Russia could spark revolutionary movements in other countries and ultimately bring down the entire imperialist system. When World War I broke out in 1914, most European socialist parties supported their own governments, voting for war credits and abandoning international solidarity. This was a profound shock and betrayal to revolutionary socialists. Lenin argued it proved that these parties had been corrupted by imperialism and that a new, genuinely revolutionary international movement was necessary. The war devastated Russia. Millions of soldiers died. The economy collapsed. Food shortages led to starvation in cities. In February 1917, mass protests forced the Tsar to abdicate. A provisional government took power, composed of liberal and moderate socialist parties. But this government continued the war and failed to address demands for land reform and peace. The Bolsheviks, a minority party, grew rapidly by promising peace, land, and bread. They also argued that power should belong to the Soviets, workers' and soldiers' councils that had sprung up spontaneously during the revolution. The slogan, "All power to the Soviets," resonated with workers and soldiers disillusioned with the provisional government. In October, the Bolsheviks launched an insurrection in Petrograd, arresting the provisional government and claiming power in the name of the Soviets. Initially, the Bolsheviks had broad support, but that support quickly eroded as the Bolsheviks' real program became clear. Lenin believed Russia could not build socialism alone. It needed revolutions in advanced countries, particularly Germany, to survive. In the meantime, Russia would be in a holding pattern, maintaining state power until international revolution could succeed. The Bolsheviks signed a harsh peace treaty with Germany, surrendering vast territories to get out of the war. They nationalized industries and banks. They confiscated landed estates and distributed land to peasants, though they intended eventually to collectivize agriculture. But almost immediately, Russia descended into civil war. Counter-revolutionary white armies, backed by foreign powers, fought to overthrow the Bolsheviks. The Red Army, created by the Bolsheviks, fought back. The war was brutal. Both sides committed atrocities. The economy collapsed further. Millions died from violence, starvation, and disease. During this period, called War Communism, the Bolsheviks adopted emergency measures. They requisitioned grain from peasants to feed soldiers and workers. They militarized labor. They banned rival parties and suppressed internal dissent. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, arrested and executed thousands of suspected enemies. Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders argued these measures were temporary, necessitated by civil war and foreign intervention. Once the emergency passed, they would establish genuine workers' democracy. But the measures never ended. Instead, they became the foundation for a permanent dictatorship. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had won the civil war, but ruled over ruins. Industrial production had collapsed to a fraction of pre-war levels. Cities were depopulated as workers fled to the countryside seeking food. The working class, supposedly the base of the socialist state, had largely ceased to exist as an organized force. The Kronstadt Rebellion in 1921 was a turning point. Sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, who had been revolutionary heroes in 1917, rose against the Bolsheviks. They demanded free elections to Soviets, freedom of speech and press for anarchists and socialist parties, and an end to grain requisitioning. Their slogan was, "Soviets without Bolsheviks." The Bolsheviks crushed the rebellion violently. Trotsky, who commanded the Red Army, called the rebels counter-revolutionaries and ordered the assault that killed thousands. This was the moment when it became undeniable that the Bolsheviks would not tolerate dissent, even from workers and sailors. Also, in 1921, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, a partial return to market mechanisms. Small businesses were allowed to operate privately. Peasants could sell their surplus production. Only the commanding heights of the economy, large industry and banking, remained state-controlled. This was explicitly a retreat, a recognition that Russia was not ready for full socialism. The question became, what had the Russian Revolution actually achieved? It had overthrown capitalism and landlordism. It had broken Russia's ties to imperialism. But had it established socialism? There was no workers' control of production. The Soviets, which had seemed like organs of direct democracy, had been subordinated to the Communist Party. The party itself was controlled by a small leadership group. The secret police suppressed all opposition. Workers had no more freedom or power than under Tsarism, arguably less. Left-wing critics, like the workers' opposition faction within the Communist Party, argued that the revolution had been betrayed. They demanded that trade unions control production, not party bureaucrats. They called for democracy within the party and within the Soviets. Lenin rejected these demands and banned factions within the party. Lenin died in 1924, before these contradictions could be resolved. He left behind a system that combined some elements of socialism, state ownership of major industries, with some elements of capitalism, market mechanisms in agriculture and small business, all governed by single-party dictatorship. Was this socialism? Was it a transitional form that would eventually lead to socialism? Or was it something entirely different? A new form of class society with party bureaucrats as the ruling class? These questions would become even more urgent under Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, who would transform the Soviet Union into a totalitarian nightmare that discredited socialism for generations. Part 6. Stalin, Mao, and Authoritarian Socialism. When the dream became a nightmare. The history of 20th century socialism cannot be told honestly without confronting its darkest chapters. The totalitarian regimes that claimed to be building socialism while crushing human freedom and dignity. These regimes murdered millions of their own citizens, created vast systems of forced labour camps, and established surveillance states of unparalleled intrusiveness. Understanding how this happened is essential to understanding socialism's trajectory and its crisis. After Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin gradually consolidated power, defeating rival party leaders through manipulation, intimidation, and eventually murder. By the late 1920s, Stalin wielded absolute power over the Soviet Union and the international communist movement. Stalin announced a dramatic shift in policy, rapid industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture. The Soviet Union, he declared, would transform itself from backward agrarian country to modern industrial power within a decade. This would be achieved through centralized economic planning and the mobilization of all resources. The first 5-year plan, launched in 1928, set wildly ambitious targets for industrial production. Factories were built at breakneck speed. Workers laboured under brutal conditions, sometimes literally working to death. The state commandeered resources from agriculture to fund industrialization. To extract resources from the countryside, Stalin forced peasants into collective farms. Peasants who resisted, labelled kulaks or rich peasants, were executed or deported to labour camps. In reality, the kulaks were simply peasants who owned a bit more land or a few more animals than their neighbours, hardly a wealthy capitalist class. The result was catastrophe. Collectivization destroyed agricultural production. Peasants slaughtered their livestock rather than turn them over to collective farms. Grain requisitions left nothing for peasants to eat. Between 1931 and 1933, a famine killed millions of people in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia. Some historians estimate 5 to 7 million dead. Stalin's government denied the famine was happening and prevented aid from reaching starving regions. Was this intentional genocide or the unintended consequence of reckless policies? Historians debate this question. What is clear is that Stalin prioritized industrialization over human life and used starvation as a weapon to crush peasant resistance. The terror escalated throughout the 1930s. Stalin launched purges to eliminate any potential threats to his power. Show trials paraded old Bolsheviks, heroes of the revolution, who confessed to absurd charges of espionage and sabotage. Most were executed. The purges extended to the military, where Stalin had most of the officer corps arrested and killed. They extended to the party itself, where hundreds of thousands of members were arrested. Between 1936 and 1938, the Great Terror reached its peak. Secret police arrested people in the middle of the night based on arbitrary quotas. Interrogators tortured prisoners into confessing to imaginary crimes. Some were executed immediately, others sent to the Gulag. The vast system of forced labour camps spread across Siberia and the Arctic. How many died? Estimates vary, but most historians put Stalin's victims at somewhere between 10 and 20 million people, killed through execution, starvation, or labour camp conditions. This is in addition to the millions who died from collectivization and famine. How could this happen in the name of socialism? The Soviet Union claimed to be building a workers' paradise, a society of equality and freedom. Instead, it created one of history's most oppressive dictatorships. Some Marxists argued that Stalinism was a betrayal of genuine socialism, that Stalin had perverted Lenin's revolution. Trotsky, Stalin's rival, who was forced into exile and eventually assassinated, argued that a bureaucratic caste had usurped power from the working class. The Soviet Union, Trotsky claimed, was a degenerated workers' state, still socialist in some economic respects, but politically counter-revolutionary. Others argued that Stalinism was inherent in Leninism. If you give absolute power to a vanguard party, if you ban all opposition, if you create a secret police to enforce ideological conformity, how do you prevent that power from being abused? Stalin did not invent the tools of totalitarianism. He inherited them from Lenin and used them more ruthlessly. But perhaps the rot went deeper into the socialist project itself. If the state owns all means of production, controls all employment, monopolizes all information, what checks exist on its power? In capitalism, for all its problems, economic and political power are at least partially separated. You can be fired from your job without losing your right to vote or speak. In a completely state-controlled economy, opposition to the government means losing not just political rights, but economic survival. The Soviet model was exported to other countries after World War II. Eastern European nations occupied by Soviet forces became communist dictatorships modelled on Stalinist lines. Workers' movements and genuine socialist activists were often the first victims, arrested by communist parties that claimed to represent them. In China, Mao Zedong led communist forces to victory in 1949, after decades of civil war. Initially, Mao's regime followed the Soviet model, but he would eventually develop his own catastrophic version of socialism. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to rapidly transform China into an industrial power through mass mobilization and ideological fervor. Peasants were organized into vast communes, sometimes containing tens of thousands of people. They were ordered to build backyard steel furnaces, abandon traditional farming methods, and report wildly inflated production figures. The result was the worst famine in human history. Agricultural production collapsed. Grain that did exist was confiscated by the state or left to rot while peasants starved. Between 1958 and 1962, somewhere between 20 million and 45 million people died from starvation and related causes. Again, historians debate the exact numbers, but the scale of the catastrophe is undeniable. Mao blamed saboteurs and counter-revolutionaries rather than admit his policies had failed. When other Communist Party leaders criticized the Great Leap Forward, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to consolidate power and eliminate his critics. The Cultural Revolution mobilized millions of young people, Red Guards, to attack the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. They destroyed temples, burned books, humiliated teachers and intellectuals, and denounced anyone associated with traditional culture or suspected insufficient revolutionary fervour. Universities closed for years. Educated people were sent to the countryside for re-education through labour. Scientists, teachers, doctors and engineers were subjected to public humiliation, torture and murder. The entire society descended into chaos as rival Red Guard factions fought each other, and everyone lived in fear of denunciation. Why would anyone support such obviously destructive policies? Part of the answer lies in the nature of totalitarian ideology. In both the Soviet Union and Maoist China, the party claimed a monopoly on truth. Reality itself was whatever the party said it was. To question official doctrine, to trust your own eyes over party pronouncements, was counter-revolutionary. George Orwell captured this in his novel 1984, based partly on his observations of communist intellectual dishonesty during the Spanish Civil War. The party in Orwell's dystopia demands that people believe two contradictory things simultaneously, that they deny objective reality in favour of whatever the party currently claims. This is not just political control, but the destruction of the human capacity for rational thought itself. Another part of the answer is that totalitarian regimes create systems where everyone is complicit. If you denounce your neighbour, you may save yourself. If you repeat obvious lies, you demonstrate loyalty. The line between victim and perpetrator becomes blurred. People commit terrible acts not because they believe in them, but because the cost of refusal is death or worse. Were these regimes socialist? They abolished private ownership of the means of production, at least officially. They claimed to act in the name of the working class. They used Marxist rhetoric and theory to justify their actions. But workers in these societies had no power, no freedom, no control over their own lives. They could not organize independent unions, strike, or criticize their conditions. They worked for wages determined by the state, producing goods for plans created by bureaucrats they did not elect and could not remove. Many worked as slave labourers in camps. If socialism means workers' control of production, these were not socialist societies. If socialism means equality, they were not socialist, as party elites enjoyed privileges ordinary people could not imagine. If socialism means freedom, they were the opposite of socialist. Yet they called themselves socialist and communist. They claimed to be implementing Marxist theory. For millions of people worldwide, especially in the West, these regimes defined what socialism meant. This association poisoned socialist ideas, discredited them, made them seem synonymous with totalitarianism. Defenders of socialism argue that these regimes were perversions, not genuine examples of socialist ideas. Critics respond that when almost every attempt to implement socialism leads to dictatorship, maybe something is wrong with the ideas themselves. This debate continues today. But what cannot be denied is the scale of human suffering inflicted by regimes claiming to build socialism. Coming to terms with this history is essential for anyone taking socialist ideas seriously. Part 7. Other socialist experiments: diversity, innovation, and failure. Not every attempt to build socialism followed the Soviet model. Some societies tried alternative paths, experimenting with different forms of ownership, planning, and democracy. These experiments are important because they help us understand which problems are inherent to socialism and which were specific to Stalinist totalitarianism. Yugoslavia under Josip Broz. Tito broke with Stalin in 1948 and developed its own model of socialism. The Yugoslav system emphasized worker self-management rather than centralized state control. In Yugoslav factories, workers' councils, elected by the workforce, had authority over production decisions, investment, and even management hiring. The councils would hire managers, set production targets, and decide how to distribute the factory's income between wages, investment, and reserves. This was meant to realize Marx's vision of workers controlling production more directly than in the Soviet model, where state bureaucrats made all decisions. It also introduced elements of market competition. Enterprises competed with each other to sell goods, creating some of the efficiency benefits of markets while maintaining social ownership. How well did it work? Yugoslavia achieved respectable economic growth for several decades. Workers had more autonomy than in the Soviet Union. The system allowed more political freedom, though Yugoslavia remained a one-party state. But worker self-management created its own problems. Workers' councils often prioritized higher wages over investment, since current workers benefited from wages while future workers would benefit from investment. This reduced long-term growth. Successful firms could not easily expand by hiring more workers, since that would dilute existing workers' income. Regional inequalities widened as richer republics developed faster than poorer ones. After Tito's death in 1980, Yugoslavia's economy stagnated and eventually collapsed. Ethnic tensions, suppressed under Tito's dictatorship, exploded into brutal civil wars in the 1990s. Whether economic problems caused political disintegration or vice versa remains debated. But clearly, worker self-management was not sufficient to create stable socialism. Cuba, after Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, offers another variation. Cuba initially followed the Soviet model but developed distinctive characteristics. The Cuban Revolution abolished capitalism and implemented comprehensive central planning. The state owned virtually all enterprises. It provided free healthcare, education, and basic services to all citizens. These achievements were real. Cuba developed world-class medical care and achieved literacy rates and life expectancy comparable to wealthy countries, despite being a poor island nation under severe US economic sanctions. But Cuba remained an authoritarian one-party state. Political dissent was suppressed. Thousands of political prisoners were jailed for expressing opposition. The economy was inefficient, heavily dependent on Soviet subsidies until the Soviet collapse, and unable to provide basic consumer goods. Castro argued that Cuban authoritarianism was a response to US hostility. The US imposed a trade embargo, attempted invasion at the Bay of Pigs, and organized numerous assassination attempts against Castro. In such circumstances, Castro claimed political freedoms were a luxury Cuba could not afford. This raises a difficult question. Can socialism survive in a hostile capitalist world without becoming authoritarian? Most socialist experiments faced intense pressure from capitalist powers through sanctions, coups, and military intervention. This pressure helped justify authoritarian measures, which then became permanent features of these regimes. Chile under Salvador Allende offers a tragic example. Allende, a Marxist, was elected president of Chile in 1970 through democratic means. He attempted to implement socialism while respecting democratic institutions and the rule of law. Allende's government nationalized copper mines, banks, and other key industries. It redistributed land to peasants and raised workers' wages. These measures improved conditions for the poor but created economic problems. Inflation, shortages, and capital flight as the wealthy moved money out of the country. The US government, under President Nixon, worked to destabilize Allende's government through economic sabotage and support for opposition groups. Nixon ordered the CIA to make the economy scream to turn Chileans against Allende. In September 1973, the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet and backed by the US, overthrew Allende in a violent coup. Allende died defending the presidential palace. Pinochet established a brutal dictatorship that tortured and murdered thousands of leftists and abolished democracy for 17 years. The Chilean experience suggested that democratic socialism might be impossible when powerful interests oppose it. Even when socialists win through elections, they face sabotage, capital flight, and potential military coups. This makes many socialists skeptical of purely electoral strategies. In Africa, many newly independent nations in the 1960s and 1970s adopted various forms of African socialism. Leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Sekou Touré in Guinea combined socialist ideas with traditional African communal values. Nyerere's Ujamaa, meaning familyhood in Swahili, emphasized collective farming, self-reliance, and rural development. Nyerere believed Africa should avoid both capitalist exploitation and Soviet-style industrialization, instead building socialism based on African traditions of cooperation. These experiments largely failed economically. Tanzania's forced collectivization of villages disrupted traditional agriculture without creating efficient alternatives. Ghana's economy collapsed under mismanagement. Guinea became increasingly authoritarian as Touré centralized power. Several factors contributed to these failures. Many African countries lacked developed economies to begin with. Colonial rule had deliberately prevented industrial development, leaving countries dependent on exporting raw materials. Post-independence governments faced enormous challenges. No trained administrators, no industrial base, often arbitrary borders that lumped together hostile ethnic groups. Additionally, Cold War politics meant that African socialist experiments became pawns in superpower competition. The Soviet Union and US both interfered, providing aid to favored factions while destabilizing others. This made it nearly impossible to pursue independent development strategies. Nicaragua, under the Sandinistas in the 1980s, attempted another variation. The Sandinista Front overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979 and implemented a mixed economy with land reform, literacy campaigns, and healthcare expansion. But Nicaragua faced US-funded contra-rebels who waged guerrilla war against the Sandinista government. The war devastated the economy and forced the government to divert resources to defense. The Sandinistas eventually lost power in elections in 1990, though they returned to power later through democratic means. What can we learn from these diverse socialist experiments? First, worker self-management, as in Yugoslavia, is possible, but faces challenges in coordinating economic activity and allocating investment. Second, providing universal healthcare, education and basic services is achievable even in poor countries, as Cuba demonstrated. But this does not require or justify political dictatorship. Third, democratic socialism faces immense obstacles when powerful foreign interests oppose it, as Chile showed. Electoral victories may be reversed through economic sabotage or military coups. Fourth, simply declaring socialism and nationalizing industries does not guarantee success, as African experiments demonstrated. Without effective institutions, skilled administrators, and economic development, socialist policies may fail regardless of good intentions. Fifth, external pressure from capitalist powers helped push socialist experiments toward authoritarianism. When facing economic embargo, military intervention, or covert destabilization, governments often respond by restricting freedoms and centralizing power. This does not excuse authoritarianism, but it helps explain it. None of these experiments created the democratic, egalitarian, free societies that socialist theory promised. Some achieved real improvements in healthcare, education, and poverty reduction. Others became nightmares of repression and economic dysfunction. Most combined both elements in varying proportions. By the late 20th century, most of these experiments had either collapsed, abandoned socialism, or become frozen dictatorships surviving through repression rather than popular support. This widespread failure sparked renewed debates about whether socialism was inherently flawed or whether the right approach simply had not yet been found. Part 8. Western Marxism and Critical Theory, when revolution failed in the West. By the 1920s, revolutionary socialists faced a crisis of theory. Marx had predicted that socialist revolution would occur in advanced capitalist countries where the working class was largest and most developed. Instead, revolution succeeded in backward Russia and failed everywhere else. In Western Europe, workers had won reforms, gained the vote, and joined reformist socialist parties rather than making revolution. Why had Marx's predictions failed? A group of intellectuals, loosely called Western Marxists, tried to answer this question by turning from economics to culture, psychology, and ideology. If workers were not naturally revolutionary, what prevented them from recognizing their true interest? How did capitalism maintain legitimacy despite producing inequality and alienation? Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime, developed the concept of hegemony while writing in prison in the 1920s and 1930s. Hegemony meant ideological domination, the way ruling classes maintain power not just through force, but by making their worldview seem natural and inevitable. Gramsci argued that in advanced capitalist societies, the bourgeoisie controlled civil society, schools, churches, media, cultural institutions. These institutions taught people to accept capitalism as natural, to see alternatives as impossible or dangerous, to blame themselves rather than the system for their problems. Workers internalized bourgeois values and came to see the world through capitalist categories. Revolution, Gramsci argued, required a long war of position, a struggle for cultural and ideological hegemony before seizing state power. Socialists needed to build counter-hegemonic institutions, alternative sources of education and culture to challenge capitalist common sense. Only when they had won this cultural battle could political revolution succeed. Gramsci's ideas profoundly influenced later leftist movements, from student radicals in the 1960s to contemporary cultural politics. They suggested that politics was not just about economics or state power, but about the stories we tell, the assumptions we make, the categories through which we understand reality. The Frankfurt School, a group of German Marxist intellectuals including Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse, developed similar insights through what they called critical theory. Fleeing Nazi Germany, they established themselves in the United States and analyzed why fascism had succeeded in Germany and why American workers accepted capitalism. Adorno and Horkheimer argued that the Enlightenment's promise of human liberation through reason had been betrayed. Instrumental reason used merely as a tool to achieve ends rather than to question those ends, had become dominant. Capitalism reduced everything to calculation, to exchange value, to what could be quantified and controlled. This colonized human consciousness itself. The culture industry, their term for mass media and entertainment, played a key role in maintaining capitalism. Movies, radio programs, popular music, all were standardized commodities that provided superficial entertainment while preventing genuine critical thought. People thought they were choosing freely when consuming culture, but the choices were illusory, all leading to the same passive acceptance of the status quo. Herbert Marcuse, in his influential book One-Dimensional Man, published in 1964, argued that advanced capitalism had eliminated the possibility of revolutionary consciousness. It had created false needs, artificial desires for consumer goods that kept people trapped in cycles of work and consumption. People thought they were satisfied but experienced only shallow, manipulated pleasures rather than genuine fulfillment. Moreover, Marcuse argued, technological rationality had become a new form of domination. The smooth functioning of technological systems, the apparent neutrality of technical expertise, made the whole apparatus of domination seem inevitable and even beneficial. To question the system appeared irrational, primitive, nostalgic. Was there any hope for liberation? Marcuse suggested that marginal groups, those not yet fully integrated into the system, students, racial minorities, the Third World, might become revolutionary subjects. This idea inspired new left movements in the 1960s. The Frankfurt School's work was brilliant and influential, but also deeply pessimistic. If capitalism had colonized consciousness itself, if culture industry manipulated desires at their root, if technological rationality left no space for critical thought, how could liberation ever occur? Some critics argued that Frankfurt School theory led to political paralysis, providing sophisticated reasons why revolution was impossible rather than strategies for achieving it. Other Western Marxists took different directions. Louis Althusser in France argued for a more rigorous scientific Marxism, purged of humanist assumptions about human nature or alienation. He emphasized structural analysis, how economic, political and ideological structures reproduced capitalism, rather than focusing on individual consciousness or agency. Althusser introduced the concept of ideological state apparatuses, schools, churches, families, media that reproduce capitalist ideology not through direct state control, but through the everyday practices that shaped how people understood themselves and the world. This was similar to Gramsci's hegemony, but more systematic and deterministic. The British historian E.P. Thompson wrote a devastating critique of Althusser's approach, arguing it eliminated human agency entirely. If structures determined everything, if people were merely bearers of structural positions, how could revolution ever occur? Thompson insisted that workers were not passive victims of structures, but active historical agents who shaped their own consciousness through struggle. This debate between structure and agency, between emphasizing how systems constrain people versus how people can change systems, became central to Marxist theory. It remains unresolved. Another important Western Marxist was Jürgen Habermas, who took over the Frankfurt School's leadership in the 1960s. Habermas was less pessimistic than his predecessors. He argued that capitalism had not entirely colonized human reason and communication. Habermas distinguished between instrumental reason and communicative reason. Instrumental reason treated people as means to ends, as objects to be manipulated. Communicative reason involved genuine dialogue, mutual understanding, and the search for truth through rational debate. In the life world, the everyday world of human interaction, communicative reason still operated. People still reasoned together, made moral arguments, sought mutual understanding. The problem was that economic and administrative systems, guided by instrumental reason, increasingly colonized the life world. Habermas believed that the potential for emancipation remained in communicative reason itself. By creating spaces for genuine democratic deliberation, free from domination and manipulation, people could collectively determine their own futures. Critics argued that Habermas was overly optimistic about rational communication's power and insufficiently attentive to how economic power shaped even apparently free dialogue. But his work influenced democratic theory and provided a more hopeful vision than earlier Frankfurt School pessimism. What united Western Marxists, despite their differences, was a turn away from orthodox Marxist economics toward culture, ideology, and consciousness. They recognized that capitalism's stability could not be explained purely by economic factors. Cultural and psychological mechanisms helped maintain the system. This shift had several consequences. It enriched Marxist theory, making it more sophisticated in analyzing how domination operates. It influenced social movements beyond the traditional working class, inspiring feminists, anti-racists, and student radicals. But it also moved Marxism away from its materialist roots. Orthodox Marxists accused Western Marxists of abandoning class struggle for abstract philosophizing. If revolution required first winning cultural hegemony, transforming consciousness, and overcoming instrumental reason, when would concrete political action occur? Moreover, Western Marxism developed primarily in universities, among intellectuals rather than workers. Its language became increasingly obscure and specialized. Whatever its theoretical sophistication, it had little impact on actual working-class movements. By the late 20th century, Western Marxism had largely abandoned the project of revolutionary social transformation. It became academic critical theory, valuable for analyzing culture and ideology, but disconnected from political practice. This reflected a broader crisis. As Western capitalism stabilized after World War II, as workers' living standards rose, as socialist experiments abroad turned authoritarian, revolutionary Marxism lost its political relevance in the West. It survived as a critical tradition within academia, but no longer as a living movement for social change. Part 9. Market Socialism and Alternative Models. Can socialism and markets coexist? One of socialism's most persistent problems has been economic coordination. How do you organize production to meet people's needs without markets or central planning? Markets, for all their problems, are information systems. Prices signal what is scarce, what is in demand, where resources should flow. How can a socialist economy replicate this without private ownership and profit? Central planning, attempted in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, faced enormous difficulties. Planning agencies had to collect vast amounts of information about what needed to be produced, in what quantities, using what inputs. They had to coordinate millions of interdependent production decisions. The informational requirements were staggering. In practice, central planning led to chronic shortages of some goods and surpluses of others. Planners could not respond quickly to changing conditions. Enterprises had incentives to hoard resources, hide capacity, and meet quantitative targets regardless of quality. If you were told to produce 10,000 shoes, you produced 10,000 shoes, even if they were all the wrong size or fell apart immediately. Some socialist thinkers asked, could you combine social ownership with market mechanisms? Could markets be used as tools for coordinating production while eliminating capitalist exploitation? This idea, called market socialism, has a long history. Early versions appeared in the 1930s during a famous debate about economic calculation under socialism. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises argued that rational economic calculation was impossible under socialism. Without private ownership and market prices, he claimed, there was no way to determine the value of different goods or the most efficient use of resources. Mises concluded that socialism would lead to economic chaos. The Polish economist Oskar Lange responded that socialist planners could simulate markets. State-owned enterprises would be instructed to behave as if they were competing firms, responding to prices set by a central planning board. The board would adjust prices until supply and demand balanced, just as markets do. This would achieve market efficiency while retaining social ownership. The debate continued for decades. Friedrich Hayek, another Austrian economist, argued that Lange's solution missed the point. Markets work not just because they establish equilibrium prices, but because they process dispersed, local knowledge that no central planner could possibly collect. Hayek gave the example of a businessman who notices a shortage of some commodity and buys up supplies, knowing he can resell at a profit. This person does not need to know why the shortage exists or understand the whole economy. He just needs to know local conditions and respond to price signals. Multiply this by millions of such decisions, and you have an economy that adapts constantly to changing conditions. Central planning, even market socialism with simulated prices, could not replicate this because it required impossible amounts of information to be collected, processed, and acted upon by planning authorities. These theoretical debates became practical questions after the 1960s, as even socialist countries experimented with market-oriented reforms. Hungary introduced the new economic mechanism in 1968, giving enterprises more autonomy and allowing some market pricing. China, after Mao's death, gradually introduced market mechanisms under Deng Xiaoping, beginning in 1978. China's reforms were particularly dramatic. Agriculture was decollectivized, with land leased to peasant families who could sell surplus production. Special economic zones allowed foreign investment and private enterprise. State-owned enterprises gained autonomy. Eventually, the private sector came to dominate much of the economy. Was China still socialist? The Communist Party remained in power and claimed to be building socialism with Chinese characteristics. But the economy was largely capitalist in practice, with private ownership, wage labour and market competition. Wealth inequality exploded. Billionaires emerged while workers laboured under conditions reminiscent of early industrial capitalism. Chinese authorities argued they were using market mechanisms as tools, that public ownership of key sectors and party control ensured socialist direction. Critics responded that this was simply authoritarian capitalism, combining the worst of both systems: capitalist exploitation without democracy, market competition without freedom. Meanwhile, Western economists continued developing market socialist models. John Romer proposed a system where capital would be socially owned through universal stock portfolios given to all citizens. People would trade shares in these portfolios but could not cash them out, only pass them on at death. This would distribute capital income equally while preserving market allocation. David Schweikart proposed economic democracy, where firms would be owned by their workers but compete in markets for customers and capital. Investment funds would be allocated through public banks based on projected returns rather than through private capital markets. This would eliminate capitalist profit while using markets to coordinate production. These models address some traditional socialist concerns. They eliminated capitalist exploitation, since workers owned their own firms. They distributed wealth more equally, but they preserved markets' ability to coordinate economic activity and respond to changing conditions. Critics raise several objections to market socialism. First, markets create inequality. Some firms succeed, others fail. Some workers would earn more, others less. Over time, inequality would grow, recreating something like class society even without private capital ownership. Second, markets encourage short-term thinking and profit maximization rather than long-term planning for social needs. They provide no mechanism for addressing collective problems like environmental damage or public goods. Third, market competition creates pressure to exploit workers, even in worker-owned firms. If your firm competes with others, you may need to work longer hours, accept lower pay, or tolerate worse conditions to survive. Workers might exploit themselves. Fourth, truly important investment decisions about developing new technologies or transitioning to sustainable energy cannot be left to market signals. These require conscious social planning. Defenders responded that these problems existed under any system. The question was not whether markets created difficulties, but whether alternatives worked better. Central planning had proven disastrous. Markets, for all their flaws, were the best available mechanism for coordinating complex economies. The debate over market socialism raised fundamental questions about what socialism actually means. Is it primarily about ownership of the means of production? If so, you could have market socialism. Or is it about fundamentally different social relations, about cooperation replacing competition, about consciously planning to meet needs rather than leaving things to impersonal market forces? Many socialists argued that true socialism required transcending markets, not just changing ownership structures. Markets commodified everything, turned human relationships into buying and selling, encouraged selfishness and competition. A genuine socialist society would organize cooperation consciously through democratic planning, not through the invisible hand. But after central planning's failures, few had concrete proposals for how democratic planning would actually work at scale. How would millions of people participate meaningfully in economic decisions? How would you aggregate their preferences and coordinate production? How would you prevent planning bodies from becoming new ruling classes? These remain open questions. Market socialism offers a potential middle path, but whether it can deliver socialism's promises while avoiding market's problems remains uncertain. No large-scale market socialist economy has been implemented under democratic conditions, so we lack empirical evidence for how it would function. Part 10. Major Critiques. The Case Against Socialism. To understand socialism fully, we must consider its most serious critiques. These come from multiple perspectives: liberal defenders of capitalism, conservative traditionalists, libertarians opposed to state power, and pragmatic skeptics who question whether socialist ideals can be realized in practice. The economic calculation argument, developed by Mises and Hayek, we have already discussed, but it is worth emphasizing its significance. This was not just a technical critique about pricing mechanisms. It went to the heart of socialist planning's feasibility. Hayek argued that the knowledge needed to coordinate a complex economy exists only in dispersed, local, often tacit form. A farmer knows when to plant based on local soil conditions and weather patterns. A shopkeeper knows which goods her customers want. An engineer knows which production methods work best for specific circumstances. This knowledge cannot be collected and processed by central planners without losing essential details and flexibility. Markets aggregate this dispersed knowledge through prices. Prices are signals that tell people what is valuable, what is scarce, where opportunities exist. No planning mechanism can replicate this coordinating function because the information requirements are impossible to meet. Socialists responded that modern information technology could solve this problem. With computers, databases, and communications networks, surely planners could collect and process necessary information. But even with modern technology, the informational requirements remain staggering. Moreover, people have incentives to misreport information to planners, to hide capacity or exaggerate needs in ways that markets do not permit, because you cannot lie to price signals. A second major critique concerns incentives. In capitalist systems, profit motives incentivize people to work hard, innovate, and satisfy customers. Competition weeds out inefficient producers. The carrot of wealth and the stick of bankruptcy drive efficiency. What incentives would operate under socialism? If everyone received equal incomes regardless of effort, why work hard? If enterprises faced no competition and could not fail, why innovate or improve? If promotion depended on political loyalty rather than competence, why develop skills? The Soviet economy illustrated these problems. Without profit motives, managers had no incentive to reduce costs or improve quality. Workers had no incentive to work productively when they received the same wages, regardless. The saying emerged, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." Innovation stagnated in centrally planned economies. New technologies were adopted slowly, if at all, because managers faced no competitive pressure to improve. The Soviet Union, despite massive scientific talent, fell further behind the West technologically with each decade. Socialists responded that capitalism's incentives were themselves problematic. They encouraged selfishness, short-term thinking, and exploitation. A socialist society could develop different incentive structures based on collective rewards, moral recognition, and intrinsic work satisfaction rather than individual profit. But critics argued this was utopian. Human nature includes self-interest. Ignoring this reality led to economic dysfunction. Moreover, moral incentives often became corrupted, turning into social pressure, conformity, and persecution of those who did not display sufficient enthusiasm. A third critique concerns political freedom and totalitarianism. This critique was articulated powerfully by classical liberal thinkers and by disillusioned former socialists. If the state controls all economic resources, all employment, all production, what checks exist on its power? In capitalism, economic and political power are separated. You can oppose the government without losing your livelihood. Independent economic resources can support opposition movements, free press, and civil society. Under socialism, especially comprehensive state socialism, opposition to the government means economic destruction. There are no independent resources to support dissent. The state controls not just political power, but economic survival itself. This concentration of power, critics argued, inevitably led to totalitarianism. Every attempt to implement comprehensive socialism had resulted in dictatorship. This was not accidental, but inherent to the project. The philosopher Karl Popper argued that utopian social engineering, trying to remake society according to an ideal blueprint, was inherently dangerous. It required enormous power to override existing institutions and practices. It claimed certainty about how society should be organized, brooking no dissent. When reality did not match the blueprint, utopian planners blamed saboteurs and wreckers rather than questioning their theories. The novelist George Orwell, himself a democratic socialist, warned that socialist movements could be captured by power-hungry elites who used revolutionary rhetoric to establish new forms of tyranny. In Animal Farm, Orwell portrayed how a revolution against human farmers led to pigs establishing themselves as a new ruling class, more oppressive than the humans they replaced. Socialists responded that totalitarianism was not inevitable, but resulted from specific historical conditions: civil war, foreign intervention, economic backwardness, and authoritarian political cultures. Democratic socialism, they argued, could avoid these pitfalls by preserving political pluralism and civil liberties while transforming economic structures. But critics pointed out that democratic socialist parties, when facing economic crises or strong opposition, often abandoned democratic principles. The temptation to override democratic constraints in the name of socialist transformation was strong. Power, once concentrated, was rarely willingly dispersed. A fourth critique addressed equality and meritocracy. Socialists emphasized equality, but critics argued that people are naturally unequal in talents, effort, and contribution. Treating everyone equally regardless of merit was unjust and inefficient. Moreover, absolute equality was impossible to maintain without coercion. People have different preferences. Some want to work more and consume more, others prefer leisure. Some are more talented or hard-working. Unless you constantly redistribute to eliminate emerging inequalities, differences would reappear. But constant redistribution required massive state power and invasion of privacy. The philosopher Robert Nozick argued that any distributional pattern would quickly dissolve under freedom. Imagine starting with perfect equality. If people can freely exchange, some will make good decisions, others poor ones. Some will work harder, others less. Soon, inequality emerges. The only way to maintain equality is through constant interference with freedom. Socialists responded that they did not advocate absolute equality, but rather fair equality, sufficient material security for all, and genuine equal opportunity. The issue was not that talented people earned more, but that the ownership of capital allowed some to live off others' labour without contributing themselves. A fifth critique concerned innovation and dynamism. Capitalism, despite its problems, had generated unprecedented technological progress and economic growth. Competitive markets rewarded innovation. Entrepreneurs who developed new products or more efficient methods prospered. Creative destruction eliminated obsolete practices and firms. Socialist economies, critics argued, were static and stagnant. Without competition and profit incentives, innovation slowed. State ownership eliminated entrepreneurship. Planning agencies could not anticipate which innovations would succeed, so they resisted change. The economist Joseph Schumpeter argued that capitalism's great virtue was creative destruction, the constant revolution in technology and organization that drove progress. Socialism, by eliminating competition and protecting established enterprises, would stifle this dynamism. Interestingly, Schumpeter believed capitalism would eventually collapse, not because of crisis or exploitation, but because its very success would create bureaucratized corporations and intellectual classes hostile to entrepreneurship. Socialism would emerge, Schumpeter predicted, but it would be a bureaucratic, stagnant socialism that would gradually throttle innovation. A sixth critique focused on practical implementation. Socialist ideals sounded appealing in theory, but every attempt to implement them had failed or produced terrible results. At what point should you conclude that the problem lay with the ideas themselves rather than just with implementation? This critique was not just from capitalist defenders, but from disillusioned former socialists. After witnessing the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia and other socialist disasters, many concluded that attempting to implement socialism caused more harm than continuing with capitalism, despite capitalism's injustices. The question was not whether socialist ideals were appealing, but whether pursuing them was worth the costs. Millions had died in famines, purges and wars connected to socialist experiments. Was it responsible to advocate trying again? Socialists responded that capitalism also had killed millions through colonialism, slavery, preventable poverty and war. The Industrial Revolution's early decades saw mass misery and child labour. Capitalism's normal functioning consigned billions to poverty while concentrating wealth in a few hands. The question was not whether socialism had problems, but whether it could do better than capitalism. Moreover, they argued you could not judge socialism's potential based on attempts in backward authoritarian societies under siege by capitalist powers. democratic socialism in an advanced democratic society might work very differently. But the fact remained that no wealthy democratic socialist society existed after a century of trying. Social democracies came closest, but were not fully socialist. This empirical record weighed heavily against socialist claims. These critiques do not exhaust the case against socialism, but they represent the most serious challenges. Together, they raise profound questions about whether socialist ideals, however appealing morally, can be realized in practice without causing more problems than they solve. Part 11. The Collapse and After: Socialism's Crisis and Reinvention. The period between 1989 and 1991 witnessed one of the most dramatic political transformations in history: the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe and the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. These events represented not just the failure of particular governments, but appeared to many as the final refutation of socialist ideas. The collapse began in Poland, where the Solidarity trade union, after years of struggle, forced the communist government to allow partially free elections in June 1989. Solidarity won overwhelmingly. Within months, communist parties were losing power across Eastern Europe. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. This was perhaps the most symbolically powerful moment. The wall had divided Berlin since 1961, preventing East Germans from fleeing to the West. Its fall represented the end of Europe's division and the failure of Soviet-style socialism to inspire loyalty or prevent people from voting with their feet. By the end of 1990, Germany was reunified, and communist regimes had collapsed throughout Eastern Europe, replaced by governments promising democracy and market reforms. In December 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, ending 74 years of socialist experiment. Why did this happen? The reasons were complex and are still debated, but several factors stand out. First, economic stagnation. By the 1980s, Soviet bloc economies were falling further behind the West. Consumer goods were scarce and shoddy. Technological innovation had slowed. The command economy could not compete with market capitalism's dynamism. Living standards stagnated, while Western standards rose. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became Soviet leader in 1985, recognized that the system needed reform. He introduced glasnost, meaning openness, allowing more freedom of speech and press. He introduced perestroika, meaning restructuring, attempting economic reforms to introduce market mechanisms while preserving socialism. But these reforms unleashed forces Gorbachev could not control. Once people could speak freely, they began demanding more fundamental change. Economic reforms disrupted the command economy without creating a functioning market, leading to shortages and inflation. Nationalist movements in Soviet republics demanded independence. Second, the regimes lacked legitimacy. They had been imposed by Soviet military power, not chosen by the people they governed. They maintained control through secret police and repression, not popular support. Once Gorbachev signaled that the Soviet Union would not use force to preserve communist governments, they collapsed almost immediately. Third, information technology made it increasingly difficult to control information. People could see through television and radio that Western living standards far exceeded their own. The gap between official propaganda, claiming socialist superiority and visible reality, became impossible to deny. Fourth, the Cold War arms race drained Soviet resources. The US, under President Reagan, dramatically increased military spending in the 1980s. The Soviet Union tried to keep pace but could not afford it. The economic burden of maintaining military parity with a far wealthier adversary helped exhaust the system. The collapse was largely peaceful, remarkably so given the scale of transformation. But it was followed by a decade of chaos, economic collapse, and social suffering in many former communist countries, particularly Russia. Russia, under Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s, implemented shock therapy, rapid transition to market capitalism. State assets were privatized, often sold at absurdly low prices to connected insiders who became oligarchs controlling vast wealth. The economy contracted dramatically. Industrial production fell by half. Life expectancy declined. Poverty exploded. This catastrophic transition discredited market capitalism in many Russians' minds, just as Soviet stagnation had discredited socialism. It also demonstrated that the problem was not just choosing between capitalism and socialism, but building functioning institutions, rule of law, and effective governance. For socialist movements worldwide, the Soviet collapse was devastating. For 70 years, the Soviet Union had been the primary model of actually existing socialism, however criticized by democratic socialists. Its collapse seemed to prove that socialism simply did not work. The political theorist Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history, arguing that liberal capitalist democracy had won the ideological struggle decisively. No viable alternative remained. Future politics would involve technical management within capitalism, not fundamental debates about different systems. Many socialist parties responded by abandoning socialist goals entirely. The British Labour Party, under Tony Blair's New Labour, embraced markets, privatisation and financial deregulation. Similar shifts occurred in social democratic parties across Europe. They retained some welfare state policies, but accepted capitalism's basic structures as unchangeable. This period, the 1990s and early 2000s, represented socialism's nadir in terms of political influence and intellectual confidence. Triumphant capitalism seemed the only game in town. But several factors began shifting this consensus. First, the promised benefits of market reforms failed to materialize in many countries. Russia and much of Eastern Europe experienced economic decline, corruption, and rising inequality rather than prosperity. People became nostalgic for the security and equality of the socialist era, even while recognizing its problems. Second, capitalism in the West began generating new problems. Inequality increased dramatically from the 1980s onward. The financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated that markets were neither self-regulating nor stable. Enormous bailouts of banks, using public money to rescue failed private institutions, undermined claims that capitalism meant freedom from state intervention. Third, new problems emerged that market capitalism seemed unable to address. Climate change, financial instability, rising inequality, the concentration of wealth and power in tech monopolies. These suggested that markets alone could not solve humanity's major challenges. By the 2010s, socialist ideas were experiencing a modest revival, particularly among younger people who had no memory of Soviet communism and saw capitalism producing inequality and insecurity. This revival took new forms, usually rejecting Soviet-style state ownership in favor of more decentralized democratic alternatives. Socialists emphasized workplace democracy, cooperative ownership, participatory planning, and democratic control of investment. Some pointed to contemporary examples: the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, a network of worker-owned enterprises employing thousands; the cooperative movement in Italy; democratic decision-making in Kerala, India; participatory budgeting in Brazilian cities. These were not full socialist societies, but demonstrated that alternatives to capitalist organization were possible. Others emphasized socialism as a long-term horizon, rather than an immediate program. The point was not to implement a detailed blueprint, but to push consistently in the direction of greater equality, democracy, and collective control over economic life. The climate crisis gave new urgency to socialist arguments. If humanity needed to rapidly transform energy systems and production methods to avoid catastrophic warming, could this be left to market forces and private profit? Many argued that only democratic planning could achieve the necessary transformation quickly enough. Yet socialist movements remained weak and fragmented compared to their early 20th century heyday. No major socialist party governed a wealthy country. No new socialist economic model had been successfully implemented at scale. The movement had intellectual energy but little political power. The Soviet collapse had not ended debates about socialism, but it had fundamentally altered them. No one could seriously propose replicating Soviet-style systems. Instead, socialists had to articulate what democratic, decentralized, market-aware socialism might look like. This was a more modest project than earlier revolutionary socialism, but perhaps more realistic. Part 12. Contemporary Socialism. Where do these ideas stand today? As we approach the middle of the 21st century's third decade, where do socialist ideas stand? The picture is complex and contradictory. Socialist parties have little power in most countries, yet socialist ideas influence mainstream politics more than at any time since the 1970s. Several factors explain this paradox. First, capitalism's recent performance has been underwhelming for many people. After the 2008 financial crisis, recovery was slow and uneven. Wages stagnated for average workers while wealth concentrated among the very rich. Young people faced worse economic prospects than their parents, despite being better educated. In the United States, the richest country in history, millions lacked health care, could not afford housing, and were burdened by student debt. Life expectancy began declining, driven by deaths of despair, suicides, and drug overdoses among working-class people whose economic futures had collapsed. These conditions made socialist critiques of capitalism resonate, even among people who would not identify as socialists. Polls showed that young Americans had more favorable views of socialism than capitalism, though what they meant by socialism was often vague, more Scandinavian social democracy than revolutionary transformation. Politicians like Bernie Sanders in the US and Jeremy Corbyn in Britain enjoyed surprising success with explicitly socialist platforms, though neither achieved power. They advocated universal health care, free higher education, wealth taxes, and breaking up monopolies. Their programs resembled mid-20th century social democracy more than Marxist revolution, but they reclaimed the socialist label that social democratic parties had abandoned. Second, the climate crisis has revived arguments for economic planning. The scientific consensus is clear. Preventing catastrophic climate change requires rapidly transforming energy systems, transportation, agriculture, and industry. This transformation must happen within decades, not centuries. Can markets deliver this transformation quickly enough? Markets respond to price signals, but carbon is not adequately priced. Markets optimize for short-term profit, but climate action requires long-term investment. Markets cannot coordinate the kind of systematic transformation needed across multiple sectors simultaneously. This has led to proposals for Green New Deals, massive public investment programs to transform economies towards sustainability while creating jobs and reducing inequality. These proposals involve significant state direction of investment and production, moving toward planned elements within market economies. Critics argue that markets can address climate change if proper incentives exist through carbon taxes and emissions trading. They warn that giving governments control over energy transformation risks inefficiency and political manipulation. But the urgency of the crisis has made more people willing to consider planning as necessary. Third, the rise of platform monopolies like Amazon, Facebook and Google has raised new questions about economic power. These companies have achieved market dominance and control vast amounts of data about people's lives. Their algorithms shape what information people see, what products they buy, what work is available. Some argue these platforms should be publicly owned or broken up, treated as utilities providing essential services. Others propose platform cooperativism, where digital platforms would be owned by their users rather than shareholders, with democratic governance and fair distribution of value. Fourth, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed both capitalism's vulnerabilities and the continuing importance of state capacity. Profit-driven healthcare systems were unprepared for a crisis that did not generate profit. Supply chains optimized for efficiency broke down when disrupted. Meanwhile, governments that mobilized resources effectively saved lives and preserved economies better than those that relied on markets. Yet state capacity varied enormously. Some governments acted effectively, others incompetently. Authoritarian China imposed draconian controls, while democratic Taiwan succeeded through transparency and public cooperation. This demonstrated that the issue was not simply state versus market, but effective governance and social trust. What forms does contemporary socialism take? Several distinct currents exist. Democratic socialism emphasizes winning power through elections and implementing reforms within democratic systems. It rejects revolutionary violence and authoritarianism while aiming for fundamental economic transformation. The goal is typically social ownership of major enterprises, worker control of workplaces, and democratic planning, achieved gradually through legislation. Libertarian socialism or anarchism continues to emphasize decentralization, direct democracy, and skepticism of state power. It advocates worker cooperatives, mutual aid networks, and federated community organizations rather than centralized state control. This tradition influences movements like Occupy Wall Street and autonomous zones like Rojava in northern Syria, which has experimented with democratic confederalism. Eco-socialism connects socialist and environmental politics, arguing that capitalism's growth imperative makes it incompatible with ecological sustainability. Eco-socialists advocate transforming production to meet needs rather than maximize profit, prioritizing sustainability over growth, and democratic planning to reduce consumption and transition to renewable energy. Some Marxists have updated class analysis for contemporary conditions. They note that traditional industrial working class has declined in wealthy countries, while service workers, gig economy workers, and precarious labourers have grown. They argue that class struggle continues but takes new forms. Fights over housing, student debt, healthcare access, and working conditions in the gig economy. Feminist socialists emphasize that economic analysis must account for unpaid reproductive labor, mostly performed by women, childcare, elder care, housework, emotional labor that makes paid work possible. They argue for socializing care work through public services, recognizing its value, and transforming gender relations alongside economic structures. Anti-racist socialists insist that class analysis must incorporate how racism structures capitalist exploitation, creating super-exploited populations and dividing workers. They advocate reparations for historical injustices and recognize that building socialism requires confronting racism, not just focusing on class alone. What are the major debates within contemporary socialism? One concerns the role of markets. Should socialists advocate completely replacing markets with democratic planning, or should they accept markets while democratizing ownership? This debate echoes older discussions, but with new urgency given planning's historical failures and markets' demonstrated coordination abilities. Another concerns the state. Should socialists aim to capture state power and use it to transform society, or should they build alternative institutions outside state structures? Statist socialists argue that you cannot transform society without controlling the state's coercive and administrative capacities. Anti-statist socialists warn that concentrating power in the state inevitably leads to authoritarianism. A third debate concerns strategy. Should socialists focus on elections and legislation, on building cooperatives and alternative institutions, on labour organising and strikes, on social movements and protests? Different factions emphasise different approaches, with most agreeing that multiple strategies are necessary, but disagreeing about priorities. A fourth debate concerns technology. Some socialists embrace technological optimism, arguing that automation and artificial intelligence could eliminate scarcity and drudgery, making full communism possible. Others are skeptical, noting that technology under capitalism typically increases control and inequality rather than liberation. What challenges does contemporary socialism face? First, the lack of compelling models. No existing society represents the democratic, egalitarian socialism that most contemporary socialists advocate. This makes it difficult to convince people that socialism is realistic and desirable. Pointing to Scandinavia is not enough if your goal goes beyond social democracy. But where is the proof that more radical socialism can work? Second, the power of capital. Wealthy individuals and corporations have enormous resources to oppose socialism. They fund political campaigns, own media, threaten capital flight and disinvestment. Even democratic socialist governments face these pressures, which can undermine reforms or provoke coups. Third, political fragmentation. Socialist movements are divided among numerous factions and parties, often spending more energy fighting each other than fighting capitalism. The left's traditional weakness for sectarian infighting continues to undermine effectiveness. Fourth, competing identities. Many progressive movements today organize around gender, race, sexuality, or environmental issues rather than class. While these concerns are legitimate, they sometimes compete with class-based organizing rather than complementing it. Building coalitions across these movements remains challenging. Fifth, the appeal of nationalism and authoritarianism. In many countries, right-wing populist movements have grown by offering simple explanations for economic anxiety. Blame immigrants, blame globalization, blame elites, and promise national greatness. These movements often attract working-class support that socialists believe should be theirs. What might socialism's future look like? Several possibilities exist. One is continued marginalization. Socialist ideas might remain intellectually influential but politically irrelevant, with capitalism adapting enough to survive without fundamental transformation. The welfare state might expand or contract, inequality might rise or fall moderately, but no socialist breakthrough occurs. Another is social democratic revival. Capitalist crisis or climate catastrophe might lead to new social democratic compromises with expanded public ownership, stronger unions and more regulation, but still within basically capitalist frameworks. This would be significant, but not the full socialist transformation many advocate. A third possibility is that climate crisis and political instability lead to authoritarian solutions rather than socialist democracy. Faced with ecological collapse and social conflict, governments might impose top-down control without genuine democracy or equality. This eco-authoritarianism would share some socialist features, public control of economy, but none of its liberatory promise. A fourth possibility is that technological change enables post-scarcity economics, making socialist distribution feasible. If automation and renewable energy make production abundant and cheap, distributing resources according to need rather than market mechanisms might become practical. But this requires political will to distribute abundance fairly rather than concentrating it further. Finally, socialism might evolve into forms we cannot yet imagine, adapting to conditions we cannot foresee. Socialist ideas have repeatedly transformed in response to changing circumstances over the past 2 centuries. They will likely continue evolving. What can we conclude about socialism after this deep examination? Several things seem clear. First, socialist critiques of capitalism identify real problems: exploitation, inequality, alienation, instability, and capitalism's inability to address collective challenges like climate change. These criticisms remain powerful and relevant. Second, implementing socialism has proven far more difficult than early socialists imagined. Economic coordination without markets or effective planning remains unsolved. Preventing state power from becoming tyrannical remains unsolved. Creating genuinely democratic control over complex economies remains unsolved. Third, the choice is not simply between pure capitalism and pure socialism. Real economies mix market and planning, private and public ownership, individual and collective decision-making in various proportions. The question is which mixture serves human needs and freedom best. Fourth, Socialism as a movement and as a set of ideas will continue to evolve. The specific forms it takes will depend on how capitalism develops, what crises emerge, what technologies become available, and what political movements arise. Fifth, the fundamental questions socialism raises remain unresolved. How should economic power be distributed? How can we balance individual freedom with collective needs? How can we organize production to meet human needs while preserving dignity and autonomy? These questions do not have final answers, but require ongoing democratic deliberation and experimentation. Socialism's history is a story of inspiring ideals, brutal failures, partial successes, and continuing relevance. It is a history of human beings trying to imagine and create better ways of organizing our common life, succeeding and failing, learning and forgetting, but continuing to believe that the existing order is not inevitable and that collective action can create more just and free societies. Whether that belief is vindicated or refuted remains to be seen. This concludes our comprehensive exploration of socialist ideas and philosophy, from their origins through their evolution, implementations, critiques, and contemporary forms. The conversation about these ideas continues, and your engagement with them, informed by this history and analysis, is part of that ongoing conversation.